Thank you, Amala. And welcome everyone to today's Educator Effectiveness Webinar. This is the first of our series for this year. I see many familiar names on our attendance list today, so welcome back to those of you who've attended the Teacher Effectiveness Webinar Series the past 2 years. And for those of you who are new, welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about assessing school climate. As I said, I'm Elizabeth Greniger. I'm your webinar facilitator. And joining me today is Dr. Jonathan Cohen from the National School Climate Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. We have an exciting presentation for you this afternoon. Before we get started and before I formally introduce Dr. Cohen, I'd like you to fill out the brief poll and let us know who you are, and so we can have a sense of who's in our audience today. Looks like we have quite a diverse group. Glad to see that we have a wide range of school-based and district-based folks, as well as several researchers in the audience. I think all of you will find some interesting information, and we hope that this content that you'll hear today will be applicable to you in whatever role you serve in. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan is the co-founder and president of the National School Climate Center at Teachers College of Columbia University. He's the co-founder and emeritus co-chair of the National School Climate Council. He's an author and editor of 4 books and over 85 publications, and he's a practicing clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Cohen.
Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here and honored to be here. And what I'm going to be talking about is really what is school climate and why is it important? I'm going to be sharing with you a range of tools that we can use, both assessment tools and improvement tools that can support building leaders and district leaders and state leaders evaluating school climate. And I'm going to very importantly be talking about what are the range of ways that educators can use this information, this data, both to engage many, many people in the community and to really support students and parents and guardians, school personnel, and even community members and leaders learning and working together to create a safer, more supportive, engaging, and healthy climate for learning. And finally, I'm going to be talking about a series of next steps for both practice leaders and policy leaders to consider in ways that really help to mobilize the whole village, if you will, to support the whole child. I am curious about how you now think about I am curious about how you're now thinking about school climate, how you in your school and or your district really define school climate, and just how it seems to you at a building level.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think at this time we'll put up a poll, our first open-ended poll, and this will give participants the opportunity to respond to the question. Okay, so Jonathan, I'm seeing some of the responses coming into the first question. Definitions of school culture revolve a lot around feelings and the way individuals in different groups are treating each other, the relationships. Okay, and it looks like for our second question related to school climate, in the places where you're all working, a range, some not so great, and then others more positive. I'd love to see the positive ones. And hopefully those of you who are having positive experiences can share some of your insight. And as we mentioned at the beginning, the parking lot is a good place to share ideas and thoughts as we go through today's webinar. Jonathan, any thoughts on what you see here, the initial responses about school climate?
Well, what I'm seeing here is the whole range of ways that people have thought about school climate over the last 30 or 40 years. As we can see, many of the comments really have to do with the atmosphere of school life, and we're implicitly or explicitly, very importantly, recognizing the social and emotional and civic aspects, both of school life and also of student learning. And as I'm going to talk more about in a moment, you're in a sense putting your finger on one important trend that is really contributing to people thinking more and more about school climate, be it a positive, supportive climate, or unfortunately, many of our public schools today don't have a very positive climate for a variety of reasons that I'll be touching on.
Great. I think that that's a nice segue into the first part of our presentation today. So we'll pull these polls down and get right into things we care about school climate.
Over the last 6 or 7 years, there's been two major national trends that have been contributing to really dramatic growing interest in school climate. On the one hand, as I think we all know, there's been a tremendous appreciation that mean, cruel, and or bullying behavior is extraordinarily prevalent and extraordinarily toxic, not only between students and students, but sometimes between teachers and students and teachers and other educators and even parents and educators. And there's been a growing research-based appreciation that when there's ongoing mean, cruel, and or bullying behavior and people don't do anything about it, it powerfully undermines kids' ability to learn, and it also, in an overlapping way, undermines their capacity to develop in healthy ways. In a different, but in some ways potentially overlapping way, in the last 6 or 7 years, there's been growing appreciation that so many of our high school students drop out of high school. As many of the listeners know, in many states, on average, 30% of high school students drop out, and students of color who are economically disadvantaged, that number is often shockingly higher, close to 50%. Both of these phenomena, growing and very disturbing phenomena, have, as I'll talk more about in a moment, contributed to a number of federal agencies and more state departments of education thinking about how can we recognize the social and emotional and civic aspects both of student life and of student learning. And that's one of the four major reasons why I think there's been this tremendous growth in interest in school climate policy and practice. When we measure school climate, which I'll be talking about in much more detail shortly, it's a simple, reliable, valid way of our recognizing these essential aspects of both student learning and school life, which are not now recognized at the federal level. We all appreciate that current accountability systems are primarily focused on student cognitive learning. And although I think in many ways the Common Core standards are much richer and nuanced and begin to touch on the social and emotional aspects of student learning, they're still first and foremost focused on student cognitive learning. In a different way, school climate improvement efforts can be thought of as an engagement strategy, a concrete way of not only recognizing the voice of students and parents and guardians and school personnel and even community members, but engaging them as co-learners and co-leaders in the improvement effort. This is something that educational researchers and many educational leaders have known that schools really need the help and the support of parents and folks in the larger community, but that's relatively rarely practiced. In a different way, and I think an equally important way, school climate reform recognizes and explicitly supports the importance of educator learning, of adult learning, and educators learning and working together in PLCs, or what Tony Breik has recently called network improvement communities. And finally, school climate reform represents a strategy that explicitly attempts to coordinate the educational, the risk prevention, and the health and the mental health promotion efforts that all of us care about. These factors have contributed to growing state and federal recognition. Although school climate is an old idea, as far as I know, the first person to write about it was a Brooklyn-based school principal named Arthur Perry over 100 years ago. In the last 40 or so years, there's been a growing body of empirical research saying that school climate matters. And in fact, all of these federal agencies that you see here, the US DOE and the Justice Department, the State Department, CDC, and SAMHSA, have all recognized and or supported school climate improvement efforts as being the most effective prevention strategy, both for bully victim bystander behavior and also high school dropouts. And that's in turn contributed to a growing number of state departments of education and districts becoming more and more curious about what is school climate reform. There isn't one national consensus about how to define school climate. I always think about how our understandings shape our goals and how goals drive behavior. And goals also suggest strategies, pedagogic strategies and or school improvement strategies that we utilize to actualize these goals. But in a certain way, everything begins with understandings and definitions. Although there are many, many definitions of school climate, there are two major, very overlapping schools, if you will, or centers which are suggesting definitions. On the one hand, the federally funded, the US DOE funded Safe and Supportive Learning TA Center, as you can see here, defines school climate as a broad, multifaceted concept that involves many aspects of the student's educational experience. On the other hand, the National School Climate Council, a group of roughly 30 policy and practice leaders that the Education Commission of the states and our center formed in 2007, has come up with what I believe is a more nuanced and in some ways richer definition, namely that school climate refers to the quality and character of school life and is based not just on the patterns of student experience, but of parents, guardians, and school personnel's experience, reflecting all of our norms and goals and values and interpersonal relationships, teaching and learning practices, and organizational structures. I would suggest that, and I'll say this in a variety of ways, that one of the potential most powerful aspects of school climate is that it is about the whole village. It's not just about students' educational experience. It's about how do we, as educators and other people in the school building, from cafeteria workers to the bus drivers, as well as parents and guardians, how are we learning and working together to support children's healthy development and their ability to learn? A positive school climate is again defined in quite overlapping, but in some ways different ways, by the Safe and Supportive Learning TA Center on the one hand, and the National School Climate Council, and also our center on the other hand. As you can see, the Safe and Supportive Learning Center is using the US DOE's model of what school climate is, namely that safety is one important dimension, that how supportive we are, a critical dimension academically and in a variety of ways, is another dimension, and how engaging or how respectful and caring interpersonal relationships are. And I believe, like the council and our center, that these are all terribly important. Our definition, which also grows out of the National School Climate Council's work, is again a little bit more nuanced, that a positive school climate is one that fosters positive youth development, that it's based on norms and values that support feelings of safety, not just physically, but socially and emotionally and intellectually, that there is respect and engagement, and that, as I'll talk more about in a moment, very importantly, that this is something, creating a positive school climate, that all of us are doing together, that educators are modeling a love for learning, and that all community members contribute to the care of the physical environment. What the research says is that school climate matters because it seems to very powerfully promote academic achievement. It supports the development of healthy relationships. It increases social responsibility. It also increases teacher retention. And what I don't have here, but what's embedded here, is that it also reduces both social and physical violence. And you can see that these are two relatively recent research summaries that really detail this if you're interested. One of the important challenges, in fact, the most important challenge today to school climate research, is that we don't have one consensual definition. So unfortunately, different researchers are using somewhat different definitions of school climate, and then in a linked way, different kind of metrics. That's a problem. Our center recently conducted a national survey of almost 700 principals and assistant principals and superintendents and assistant superintendents. And what emerged in summary is that virtually all of them reported that they know that school climate matters. Interestingly, the vast majority of them said they needed and wanted detailed guidelines about how to identify a school climate survey if their district or state didn't have one already. Understanding, are there other kind of metrics that exist that can support readiness, for example, or the actual school climate improvement process? And are there roadmaps that are out there that can support, most importantly, building leaders? And I'm going to be detailing just these kinds of things in the slides to come. There's a lot of school climate research going on today, and I just want to recognize that one of the very important and exciting pieces of school climate research that's going on now is being led by Dewey Cornell and his colleagues in a big federally funded grant that's focused not on school climate comprehensively, but specifically on safety. And what Dr. Cornell and his colleagues have discovered in a series of important studies is that there's two variables that have a real impact on bullying and on kids staying in school, and that is how supported do students feel and what kind of leadership style exists in the building. And what Dewey and his colleagues have found, in a way not surprisingly, is that when students feel significantly more supported, and when they feel, on the other hand, that school leaders are listening to them and working with them as opposed to just being top-down, that has extremely positive implications in terms of how safe and also connected students feel to school.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. That was a very comprehensive overview and description of really where we are with school climate, why it's important, why is this a topic that we should be concerned about. And I think those on the line can appreciate that as they're all here today to learn more about the topic. So now we want to open it up for another question. You see on the screen the open-ended question relating to some of the factors that lead to a positive school climate. We're going to put up another open-ended response box, and there we'd like you to think about what factors lead to a positive school climate in the schools where you're working. So some of this you already addressed in one of our initial questions, but let's delve a little bit deeper into really the factors that are promoting a positive school climate where you are. I love to see leadership as one of our first responses. It's extremely important to have strong building, district, and state leaders who understand the importance of the school climate as, part of what makes schools run effectively.
Right. And these thoughts are I think also very importantly underscoring that a school, like a person, is a complex organism. There's many things going on that in fact contribute to the climate of the school being sunny, in other words, safe and supportive, engaging and healthy, or stormy. Certainly though, kind of building leadership and classroom leadership and also potentially student leadership are certainly anchoring dimensions to a positive or a negative school climate.
We'll give folks just another 30 seconds or so to get some responses in there. Okay, Jonathan, I think it's a good time to move on to our next section on assessing school climate, and you can more in depth on how we're actually measuring school climate.
That sounds great. Interestingly, in our recent survey of close to 700 building leaders and district leaders, almost 90% reported that they believe that school climate assessment can and should be used to shape school improvement. And I strongly agree with that for a variety of reasons that I'll be outlining shortly. It's first useful to consider when schools use school climate surveys, which are the most common way that folks are now measuring school climate. Well, what's actually measured? Again, the Safe and Supportive Learning Center, this model on the left of really measuring these different aspects of engagement and safety and environment grow out of the US DOE's model of school climate. On the other hand, the councils and our center's model is somewhat different and includes a couple of explicit dimensions that the Safe and Supportive Learning Center doesn't, namely teaching and learning. I've never fully understood why the US DOE model doesn't explicitly include teaching and learning, because I think that there's a shared understanding that the work of schools is teaching and learning. And school climate, however we define it, is about how do kids and how do educators and others feel about being in schools. As folks wrote in that initial question, whether we call it the atmosphere of school or the character and quality of school life, teaching and learning is certainly centrally important. Both of these models, as you can see, recognize the fundamental importance of not just students, but also, I would suggest, the adults feeling safe, and also what kind of interpersonal relationships there are, and the institutional environment. Our center also has some questions only geared to educators and staff that really kind of begin to tap leadership patterns and just how do we treat one another in collegial and fundamentally important ways, as Jim Comer has been talking about for over 35 years, and Tony Bright has in the last dozen or so years. There are 4 different kinds of school climate measurement tools that I'd suggest are worth being aware of and thinking about. Readiness assessments, comprehensive surveys, community surveys, and process surveys. If you believe, as I think everybody does, that sunsets are perfect, but schools like people never are, and we need to be involved in a continuous process of learning and development, evaluating readiness is potentially incredibly helpful. Currently, there are no reliable and valid school climate assessments that tap readiness. Our center, by the end of this summer, I believe, will have the first valid and reliable measure that asks the principal and members of his or her leadership team to think about readiness in a variety of ways in terms of kind of what are some of the important planning and preparation tasks that optimally create the foundation for more comprehensive school climate evaluation. For example, if you believe that an effective school climate improvement process is all about the principal igniting the intrinsic motivation of students and parents and guardians and fellow school personnel, again, not just educators, but other members of the school personnel staff, we suggest that it's useful for the principal and members of his and or her leadership team to think about how representative is your leadership team. Right from the beginning, this is something that can involve all sectors of the school community. In a very different but terribly important way, there are unfortunately some groups of educators at the building level who are learning and working together in a culture of blame and shame. This is something that I was noting a moment ago when I talked about James Comer's work and also Tony Bright's work. Dr. Comer has been talking about this is something that potentially stymies any and all school improvement efforts. And as some of the listeners may know, Tony Bright and his colleagues, when Dr. Bright was in Chicago, wrote an extraordinarily important book in 2002 called Trust in Schools. And he confirmed what Dr. Comer has been saying for decades from a series of important experimental and also ethnographic studies, namely that if educators are learning and working together in a culture of blame and trust, it doesn't matter what kind of school improvement goals we have, very little is going to change. And when we discover that this is the case in a school, we recommend to the principal that he or she only focus on team building, because we've had the same experience that Dr. Comer and Dr. Breich have had, that even if the principal wants to move ahead, if educators or a group are not a team, not able to at least begin to collaboratively solve problems together, to set goals, that any kind of school improvement is not going to work. Readiness also really underscores the fact that schools, like people, always have problems, and that what's important is to use data like a flashlight rather than a hammer. There are today scores of comprehensive school climate surveys, and usually the term a comprehensive school climate survey is linked to a survey that recognizes student voice, parent-guardian voice, and school personnel voice. And both the US DOE and also the School Climate Council recommend that these surveys be reliable and valid and not longer than 15 or 20 minutes, and also echoing what I just said, recognize student, parent, and school personnel voice. The council goes on and adds two more recommended steps, and that is that one, that school climate reports be educator-friendly in the sense of really presenting and sharing the data in a variety of ways. We've, over the years, learned that there's some principals and or members of the school's leadership team that love to look at data. And they love the detailed report that includes all of the nuances from a kind of quantitative perspective. There are other school leaders who glaze over, and they want and need summary statements about what are we seeing. But also, I think critically importantly, school climate surveys should lead to a report that has information about possible next steps and resources. For example, in our work and in many other groups' work, one very common, perhaps the most common, school climate finding is that parents and school personnel on the one hand believe that there are some students who feel mildly unsafe in schools, but it is in the mild, occasionally the moderately severe range. On the other hand, a variety of centers, including ours, have discovered that characteristically, students report feeling severely unsafe in schools. And when we and other groups have dug deeper, almost always what this leads to is the fact that bully victim bystander behavior is extraordinarily pervasive and too accepted in schools. Oh, just one other thought about this. There are 3 existing independent reviews that look at school climate surveys that are out there, and that information should be provided to you. If it's not as part of the webinar, I'm pretty sure that it is. I can certainly send you these 3 independent reviews. I'm proud and happy to report that the one comprehensive school climate survey that's endorsed by all of these 3 surveys is our center, the National School Climate Center's Comprehensive School Climate Inventory, but there are a variety of other very good surveys out there as well. There's more and more interest in thinking about how can we build meaningful bridges between the school and the community. And although I know that there's many very exciting, rich service learning efforts going on across America that are beginning to build meaningful school-community partnerships, but my impression, having talked to leading school community researchers and also district leaders across the country, is that today the most common way that building and or district leadership builds bridges between the school and the community is to ask the community for fiscal resources. That's a very meaningful partnership process because schools do need additional funding. Our center a couple of years ago created a new community scale that engages middle and or high school youth to take a very short 5 to 8 minute survey that can be used with any comprehensive school climate survey that's being used out into 14 or 15 sectors of the larger school community, from the faith-based sectors of the community to law enforcement, local media, local civic and political leaders, and many more. And this very short community scale asks community members and leaders two sets of questions. On the one hand, tell us about your understanding of our current school community partnership. And on the other hand, asking community members and leaders if they'd be interested in learning about the school's improvement goals and helping. We in part developed this process because I had learned, and many of us across the country have learned, how common, how pervasive bully, victim, bystander behavior is. And we had the notion that leaders from the faith-based world and civic leaders and many other leaders have potentially incredible power in talking about what does it mean to be a witness, and how we all make a conscious or an unrecognized decision when we see something that's not okay, whether it's bullying or someone walking down the street who's in trouble or walking down our school hallways crying. We all make a decision, consciously or not, to be a bystander, doing nothing, or even actively aiding the bully, for example, or on the other hand, an upstander, which is our word for struggling in the best sense of the word to be socially responsible. We, a couple of years ago, did one set of pilot studies, and we're now engaged in a second wave of pilot testing here and in Chile. And in one of the things that's incredibly exciting to me is that students and community members are coming up with all kinds of ideas based on this little community scale, and youth being leaders here that I never imagined. Everything from people in senior citizen homes creating meaningful platforms to learn from students in high school, but also for the high school students to learn from them, to things like elk clubs telling students that they had all kinds of after-school jobs and that they didn't know how to reach the students to tell them about this, and then collaboratively creating fairs. But in addition to these potentially neat, rich, new school community partnerships, one of the things that we are also seeing are people from the pulpit, people from local media, talking importantly about what does it mean to be a witness, and how this is a really centrally important question for all of us to struggle with. I'm not aware of any other community scales, but actually I'd very much like to learn from any of you who are listening and also participating in this. If you're aware of other overlapping school community partnerships along these lines, I'd very much value learning about them from you in terms of both what you're doing in public education and or in private schools, independent school education, and or parochial schools. There also are important process assessments. At this point, I'm not aware of any reliable and valid process measures. Our center is now piloting end-of-stage measures, where at the end of the initial planning and preparation phase of the school climate improvement process, at the end of the evaluation phase and the action planning, and then the implementation and the beginning a new phase, we have short surveys that support the principal and his or her leadership team recording and reflecting on what did we do. And our hope is that this is going to be helpful in several ways. One, we all know how fundamentally, how foundationally important it is for us to be reflective about what we're doing. Another reason is that we know that there's tremendous principal turnover today, so that these end-of-stage measures really provide an opportunity for us recording history. So if in 2 or 3 years down the road, when a school begins the school climate improvement process anew, a new principal and or new members of the principal's leadership team are going to have an opportunity to look back and see last time during the planning and preparation phase what was done and what wasn't done. There's a new kind of process measure that our center is actually beginning to use in Minnesota. We've just begun a very exciting project with the Minnesota Department of Education, and we're working with over 20 leaders from their different regional sites. As most people on this call know, every state has a group of PD staff and technical assistance staff that's between the State Department of Education on the one hand and district leadership on the other hand. And these leaders in New York, they're called part of the BOCES network or the Board of Cooperative Education Network or the cooperative regional leaders in Minnesota. These are the people who are translating state policy and practice guidelines into day-to-day life on the ground at the district and the building level. And building on the notion of creating professional learning communities, or what Tony Breik talks about in his, I think, very important new 2015 book called Learning to Improve, we're supporting and learning and working both with regional leaders and also the building leaders that they're going to be supporting over the course of a year or more to delineate what are the strategic school climate improvement goals that they're going to be focusing on, and also to delineate transparently their understanding of what are strategies and or drivers, whether it's school-wide improvement strategies and or relational strategies and or instructional strategies that they think are going to move the needle, and then to have some kind of metrics to very quickly begin to understand and share with others, very much in the spirit of a PLC, what's working and not working. So we're just beginning to do this, and this is a new kind of a process measure. Although our focus today is school climate, I just want to briefly recognize something which many of you know, and that is that on the one hand, school climate and classroom climate are overlapping but different. We can have a school that overall has a really negative school climate where students and even educators, for example, feel unsafe, but within that building have a terrific teacher who's engaged kids to be co-learners and co-leaders in the classroom, and kids in that given classroom may feel incredibly safe and really connected and excited about learning. Bob Pianta and Jerry Freiberg are two of the leading researchers in this area. And as some of you may know, Bob Pianta has created a very sophisticated scoring system called CLASS to help researchers and also potentially practitioners understand what are classroom leaders doing at the classroom level, and how is that supporting or sometimes inadvertently undermining a positive classroom climate. So although I'm not going to go into this in this webinar, both Jerry's work and also Bob Pianta's work are important for those of you to be aware of who are thinking both about school as well as classroom climate measurements.
This is great, Jonathan. That was a really helpful, more deep look at the different ways we can measure school climate. I know folks are having some questions. I see a question over there in the parking lot. Daniel's asking, we're going to touch on PBIS a little bit later, so hang on to that thought.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, and others feel free to ask any questions in the parking lot as they arise. We'll be sure to get to those either when we see them or if we have the opportunity later on in the webinar. And also share your thoughts and ideas. I know, like Jonathan said, we're very open to hearing what's working in your schools and districts and what you're doing that might be the same or different than what you're hearing in today's presentation. So at this time, we're going to do another poll, an open-ended question related to school climate surveys. So you've just heard a lot about that. And now we're interested in hearing from you. What are you using in your schools or districts? And you can even add a little bit more information about that. How are they being used and are they effective? And while folks are working on that and typing some responses, I think it would be a good time. We had several questions that came in through our registration. And Jonathan, I think what we'll do is dive into a few of those while folks are thinking and responding.
Sure.
So one thing that comes to mind as you were talking a lot about these different measures, and one of the questions one of the participants asked was really thinking about how do we ensure that our surveys or our different ways of looking at school climate are created and used in ways that help to reduce administrators' fears of what the results will be and how that will reflect on them as school administrators.
Yeah, and that worry, I think, is very understandable because we all know more or less that so many educators today, I think understandably, feel that they're operating in a climate of blame. I think, unfortunately, federal and state educational policy and our whole system of kind of holding principals and superintendents as being accountable often feels punitive, and it actually discourages principals and superintendents adopting a longer-term model, really a model of kind of continuous learning and development. I don't fully understand why that is, because I know that American business and the military have really embraced the notion that no matter how terrific we may be doing as a given business or a given military unit, we're always going to have problems, and the important thing is to focus on understanding what are our strengths and needs and learning. And that's exactly the stance educators obviously take vis-a-vis students. And yet the federal government today, in a very curious way, is not practicing what it preaches in that regard. So I'm actually very appreciative that there's lots of building leaders and lots of district leaders who've called me up and said, literally, John, I'm scared about administering a school climate survey and being transparent because, in fact, I'm worried that then someone is going to use anything that's negative to nail me. And that happens sometime. I know, in fact, that what building leaders and what district leaders can and need to consider is really before they administer a survey, during the initial planning and preparation process, how can they begin to set in motion a conversation about this truth that everybody knows? No person and no school is perfect. We all have strengths, and we all have needs, and we all have weaknesses, and the important thing is not to blame. The important thing is to understand, and for us then to collaboratively to prioritize our goals and to work on those together. But in saying that, which I think is a truth, I'm also aware that some principals or some superintendents listening to me right now may be saying, you know, Jonathan Cohen, that's easy for you to say, but I'm in a really contentious situation, whether it's with the union or with a given school board member or whomever, and some people are really stuck on a blaming and a shaming stance, and that's a problem.
Well, we're getting a lot of really interesting responses to this question here in our poll. And I'd like to just kind of get into some of the comments I see and hear your thoughts, Jonathan. I see a few people are mentioning, some are mentioning that they're not using any school climate measures, which Hopefully after today's webinar, that might change. Others are saying that they're really using something that's developed at the district level, or maybe adapting something that their state has worked with, or adapting another measure that they know that's out there. Can you talk to us a little bit about those approaches in developing your own measures, or using in some way, shape, or form, adapting a measure that's existing?
Yeah, yeah. When our center started to focus on school climate almost 15 years ago, there were at that time only 2 or 3 valid school climate measures out there. And the norm was that districts would in fact kind of hobble together their own climate survey in a way that actually wasn't reliable and valid. And in fact, for several years, any time that I was called into a school district, I in fact did the same thing. I would collaboratively create a very simple survey until one day I realized something that I had been taught in graduate school and foolishly forgot, and that is that I realized that people were interpreting what I thought were simple questions in totally different ways. In other words, that my informal survey wasn't reliable and valid. I didn't know that in fact people were answering the questions in ways that I thought. So I'm actually not in favor of districts hobbling together their own school climate survey. It's a little bit different, although I think still dangerous in some way, when a school or a district takes a survey that has been developed in a valid and reliable manner, and they tweak it or they adapt it or they use only parts of it, because we again don't necessarily know whether that's valid and reliable in the sense of kind of those responses meaning what in fact we think it's going to mean. Now, the other truth is that more and more states are creating their own valid, reliable school climate surveys, and I'm certainly strongly in favor of kind of building leaders and district leaders who are thinking about school climate measures using tools that are reliable and valid.
That makes good sense. I think a counter argument to that is that if that's not possible, or if schools or districts are just not there yet to use something that's already built, and they are,
That's
using
right.
a system that's kind of put together, I think what I'm seeing a lot here in the responses is related to the use and what is the data being used for. Can you talk to us a little bit about that piece? In particular, I'm seeing some people are commenting that this is part of a larger effort of comprehensive school reform and improvement efforts, and that they may be collecting the data and using it in ways to improve the bigger system, or they may be targeting very discrete areas of their system.
Yeah. No, in our SCRQ, or the School Climate Resource Questionnaire that I've mentioned a couple of times, that tapped almost 700 building and district leadership, what we discovered was that people are using school climate surveys for many reasons. There are a lot of principals and even more superintendents who use this to really garner a snapshot of the health of the school. Many certainly want to use it to support a school climate improvement process. Some people are using it for teacher or principal evaluation. And very interestingly, and I think very importantly, there's a significant number of building leaders and or district leaders who appreciate that if the principal authentically says to the community, I'm really interested in what you think our strengths and needs are, that's a powerful engagement strategy. That's a meaningful, effective way of the principal articulating a truth, which is that he or she needs the help of students and parents and guardians and colleagues to, in fact, make meaningful school improvement efforts. And Michael Fullen and Tony Bright and a growing number of people who are studying what is effective implementation are really underscoring that. as important as the individual teacher is, as important as the principal is, as important as quote-unquote evidence-based programs are, those factors, those variables alone don't transform a school. School transformation needs to be based on the principal igniting the intrinsic motivation of as many people in the community to be co-learners and co-leaders. And school climate surveys can in fact powerfully help to further that.
That's really helpful to hear. I think too, we have another question over here in the parking lot. Amy's asking about survey fatigue. I think this is related to what we've been talking about in general in the validity of the measures. Can you talk to us a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, well, I have two thoughts about that, an empathic thought and a strong leaning. The empathic thought is I totally appreciate survey fatigue, and unfortunately I know that so many teachers, so many principals that I talk to across America, they talk, I think, correctly about there's all these surveys, and actually more often than not people don't even tell them about the results, and it's not being used to really support an improvement process. That's discouraging. There are some schools that take school climate surveys and they only do a sampling. I think certainly for certain kinds of research studies, that's entirely legitimate. On the other hand, the extent to which we're measuring school climate to improve school climate, and if we believe what I articulated a few minutes ago, namely, as much as possible, this needs to be the whole village learning and working together, I'm strongly in favor of not doing sampling. Because if all the kids, if all the parents and guardians, if all the school personnel, again, not just educators, but the cafeteria workers, et cetera, are taking this, that's a step that can meaningfully support everybody in the building feeling we're in this together. And school transformation, importantly, is based on that.
And likewise, to add to that, and some of the comments that are still coming in and questions in the question we asked, what we do with that information once it's collected. Are you seeing effective dissemination measures of how we're bringing this information back to the stakeholders that we're collecting it from? So how are we reaching our parents, our students, all of our school workers, and sharing the results with them?
You know, from my perspective, there's actually too little focus on that. My sense is that there are more and more superintendents and also building leaders who are measuring school climate. But on the other hand, my sense, both from this national survey, but also talking with principals and SUPs across the country, is that a lot of people aren't quite sure how do we use this data. And there also is fear that if building leadership is really transparent about strengths and needs and weaknesses, that in fact someone is going to use that just to attack them. On the other hand, as I'm going to talk in a much more detail about in a moment, there's, I believe, extraordinarily exciting opportunities to use this data to really improve schools in ways that further significantly safer, more supportive, engaging, and healthy climates that help to make schools places where kids are learning not only how to be school successful, but also successful in life.
Hear, hear. At this point, I think it's a good time to move into our next section on improving school climate. We can talk in a little more detail about some of your ideas there.
Sounds great. The DOE's TA Center doesn't define what an effective school climate improvement process is. And I think it's very important to remember that what school climate is, exactly like what SEL, social emotional learning, is, that's different than what an effective school climate improvement process is, or what an effective school-wide SEL improvement process is. The National School Climate Council, just a couple of years ago, developed this definition of, of an effective school climate improvement process, which is a mouthful, but I think it's a very rich, meaningful statement, that this is an intentional effort, that it's strategic, that it's collaborative, really including as many people in the whole school community as possible, that it's transparent, that it's data-driven, and that it's democratically informed, that even though paradoxically the principal is not elected, he or she is the boss, we all know that if the principal is not a servant leader, if he or she is not listening and learning and working with others, too often no one follows. And that this process is one that it is designed to ignite the intrinsic motivation of students and parents and school personnel to learn and work together to create safer, more supportive, engaging, and healthy schools. One way, one simple, but I think profound first way of thinking about the school climate development model is something that my colleague Joanne Freiberg has been talking a lot about. Joanne is part of the Connecticut Department of Education and is a national school climate leader. And this box, if you will, really shows how above the line, so often what all of us end up doing is dealing with problems, reacting to student behavior, or on a school-wide basis, again, responding to pervasive issues. And our frame, our recommendation is that a simple but potentially incredibly powerful lens or new perspective is that the foundation of an effective school climate improvement process is that we're working below the line. We're thinking about how do we support student growth and skill development. And again, in a proactive way, systemically informed, how can and do we need to work together as a community to create safer and more supportive, respectful, school community-wide climates for learning? This is a simple idea. I would suggest it's a profound one. Understandings shape goals, which suggest strategies that we utilize to actualize these goals. A little more than a year ago, the National School Climate Council spent months thinking about what are the essential goals that shape all pro-social educational efforts. And by pro-social educational efforts, I mean character education and social-emotional learning, 21st century skills, mental health promotion activities, and school climate improvement efforts. And we developed this consensus statement, which is going to actually be published in the Teachers College Record in the next couple of weeks, in more detail, suggesting that our understanding is that effective pro-social goals need to include school-wide improvement goals, pedagogic goals, and interpersonal goals. We all know, for example, from a systemically informed point of view, and as many of you have noted already, that leadership is critical. But when I say leadership, I don't only mean principal leadership or teacher leadership. I also very importantly mean student leadership and also parent-guardian leadership. Again, my understanding of the foundation for an effective school climate improvement process is this is teamwork, and that principals can and need to think about how to authentically engage and empower particularly students, but everyone else I've just mentioned, to be co-learners and co-leaders, which obviously overlaps with the second bullet point of engaging the whole village. Systemically, another critical dimension is measurement. We all know that what's measured is what counts. We also know that in spite of the incredible growing interest in school climate, the measurements that count the most now are Common Core testing. I can't tell you how many stories I hear from across the country of people saying, Jonathan, I can't do anything more now because the next 6 weeks, all I'm focusing on is prepping kids for taking these Common Core tests or taking them. And in a certain way, as sad as that makes me feel, I certainly understand that. Those measurement scores result in schools and or principals literally being given a grade. And again, it's not a grade that's being given appreciatively. Unlike an idea that Joel Klein, who was the chancellor here in New York City a number of years ago, suggested when he recommended that cohorts of 35 comparable schools be put together and evaluated not annually, but every 3 years. He also talked about how we have to do certain annual assessments, and I appreciate that. I think that in a very wise way, Joel Klein was saying something researchers and school leaders know, that is, it's rare that we see meaningful and major school improvement in 1 year. It's really more over a 3 to a 5 year period that we can see meaningful improvements. And Klein was suggesting in a way that I wish that the US DOE and state departments of education would consider, that we can create models where we're comparing comparable schools. And if we discover, as I suspect that we would, that let's say in a cohort of 35 schools, that a third really got better over that 3 years, and a third not too much changed, and a third maybe even got worse, we know that the principals and what was happening in that first third, they're doing something different. We have an opportunity to learn from them and to position those principals to be coaches to the schools that weren't doing so well. We also know that policy, which I'll be talking about more in a little bit, is another critical dimension. I think that everybody knows, even though this is not measured, this is not recognized, that adult learning matters, and that also codes of conduct or the rules that we have are another important systemic dimension. In a somewhat overlapping but different manner pedagogically, I think most people know that how we act as a teacher, just like how we act as a parent, is much more important than what we say. And the extent to which we're explicitly supporting teacher development and principal development in ways that enhance their ability to be mindful of what is their behavior teaching, and what are the ways that we can use a mistake, a moment of confusion as a teachable moment, rather than something to be embarrassed about or cover over, that's potentially profound. In a different but overlapping way, there's now extraordinary consensus that although too many teachers use punishment as a classroom management strategy, and that punishment, although it may work a little bit in the short run, it doesn't work, it even harms in the long run, and that we can and need to develop classroom management styles, strategies that are based on learning, that's a profound truth. And there's a variety of pedagogic strategies, from moral dilemma discussions to cooperative learning, to experiential learning, service learning, that all can further intentional social and emotional and ethical and civic, as well as intellectual or cognitive learning. And then finally, there are curriculum, and there are terrific curriculum out there, some in a box, if you will, curriculum that's been developed, some very unstructured, like Facing History and Ourselves, some extraordinarily structured, like Second Steps, which research shows make a difference. And there's some teachers who also think about how can we utilize a backwards design model of curriculum development to intentionally infuse pro-social learning objectives and pro-social learning activities into existing language arts or social studies or history. Less easy to do in science and math. And finally, at the end of the day, I sometimes think what really counts is the 3 R's. Relationships, relationships, relationships. And as we all know more or less, that's an old idea, and in fact, I think it's a truism. And there are some buildings and districts that are very mindful of that and talk explicitly about what are we doing as educators to create healthy, connected relationships with kids. I don't think that we do that as much as we can and we need to. And we can and need to finally also help educators to understand issues really related to mental health and mental illness. I know that historically in my work with educators across the country, until the last couple of years, so many educators, in many ways understandably, when mental health, mental illness issues came up, they would literally or figuratively say to me, Jonathan, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about that. I haven't been trained in that area. That's the business for psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists. And I understand that because mental illness is scary. I'm appreciative that President Obama, with the whole now is the time, state funding and district funding, is saying simply that's not okay for us as educators just to say this is a realm we can't deal with, because in fact we are dealing with it. And one of the things that we can and need to do is to strengthen partnerships between school counselors and educators, not to make educators psychotherapists, but certainly to support educators understanding what does it mean, for example, when they get nervous with a student, when they're hearing a given story or reading a given essay, and what are the appropriate helpful steps that they can take when that happens. Concretely on the ground, although there's a variety of goals that I was just describing that are worth keeping in mind, one simple way of thinking about the school climate improvement process is that under the leadership of the principal, he or she is setting in motion conversations about these three essential questions. What kind of school do we want our school to be? And I would suggest, and many would suggest, this is one of the most important tasks that principals have the opportunity of addressing in the initial planning and preparation process. Creating a conversation about this question. When that happens, and the school begins to develop a shared vision, that's our big goal. And then when we use, whether it's a comprehensive, reliable school climate survey, or there are other schools that use more informal school climate measurement strategies, like a walkthrough or like focus groups, whatever it is, that data about what our current strengths and weaknesses are, hopefully from a school climate survey, simply because we know that's potentially reliable and valid and more comprehensive, that creates an opportunity for us to conduct a gap analysis. And I want to underscore the word us, because again, ideally, based on our experience, although the principal is the captain of the ship, the principal is the one that's going to make final decisions, the more that he or she is recognizing student voice and parent-guardian voice and the voice of all of his or her colleagues about what kind of school do we want our school to be, and then with a survey or other methods recognizing what do people think are our strengths and needs, that creates an opportunity for the community to conduct a gap analysis. Here's our vision, here's our current reality, and given this gap, what kind of school-wide and or instructional and or relational goals do we all want to work on together? That's one very simple way of thinking about a school climate improvement process. Interestingly, there's another very interesting trend going on in America of more and more groups in the pro-social world, ASCD's Whole Child Initiative, CASEL, Character.org, which until recently was called the Character Education Partnership, Harvard's Making Caring Common, Our Center, 21st Century Skills, and many others. There's an interesting trend toward trying to think about what are the common denominators, systemically, relationally, and instructionally, that characterize effective efforts. And what I showed you a couple of slides ago is the National School Climate Council's attempt to do just that. In our survey, of almost 700 building and district leaders, 75% of them, interestingly, said they were confused about how are three-tiered behaviorally informed systems like PBIS similar and or different from school climate reform. Unfortunately, and I don't understand this, Arne Duncan, I think, has complicated matters because he's in different ways almost said that PBIS is school climate reform. I would agree that there are very meaningful similarities between school climate reform and three-tiered behavioral systems like PBIS. They're both school-wide efforts. They're both in broad strokes focused on positive change. They're both focused on student learning. They both in different ways support student, family, educator, community partnerships. They're certainly both data-driven. PBIS, at least to some extent, appreciates adult behavior and the importance of adult modeling. And they're both thinking about policy as well as practice. However, I believe that there are more differences than similarities. PBIS started in special education. The goal for PBIS is to eradicate problematic student behavior. The goal, on the other hand, for school climate reform is to bring together the whole school community to support their understanding. What kind of school do we want our school to be? What are our current strengths and needs? And what kind of goals do we want to work on together? School climate reform and PBIS use totally different data sets. PBIS uses behavioral data, which is linked to problematic student behavior. And very, very importantly, PBIS is a behaviorally informed model that focuses on student problems, and it's based on extrinsic motivation. It's a carrot and stick model. Unlike school climate, which is a bottom-up model that's designed to ignite the intrinsic motivation of everybody in the school building to think about a range of school-wide instructional and one-on-one efforts, hopefully in a coordinated manner. PBIS is very much a top-down, adult-driven model. It's not a community-driven model. And school climate reform is really grounded in the notion that we need to create PLCs, that adult learning is centrally important. So although I'm appreciative that PBIS, like every school improvement effort, is evolving, and I know that in our work in the Midwest, in Minnesota, we're in incredibly rich conversation with many PBIS educators there, and I don't see PBIS and school climate reform as incompatible. Some of my esteemed colleagues do because they feel so strongly that an extrinsically based model is so counter to an intrinsically based motivational model, but we differ about that. I think that these are potentially complementary efforts. Over 60% of building leaders and district leaders said that they want and need to understand what are roadmaps that are out there that really delineate research-based tasks and benchmarks that support an effective improvement process. And there are a number of different overlapping, but in many ways quite different roadmaps, and let me just mention a couple. Character.org, again, formerly the Character Education Partnership, has something called the 11 Principles of Effective Character Education. And they have a terrific manual that, in a sense, operationalizes the range of ways that building leaders and classroom leaders can translate these school-wide improvement goals and also these instructional goals into day-to-day life. CASEL, as many people know, is now working in a very exciting way in a number of districts. I think that they're in the process of taking what was a roadmap and revising that right now. CASEL, I think, has and continues to do extraordinarily important work. And although many people who think about the label SEL think about instruction alone, and that was actually CASEL's focus, a dozen years ago, 15 years. Over time, CASEL, like I think most school improvement organizations, have appreciated that we need to pair instruction on the one hand with a school-wide improvement effort, and that's their theory of change, just as it is for Character.org and our center. Our center, a number of years ago, developed something called the School Climate Implementation Roadmap that synthesizes research and best practices from SEL and character education, from full-service schools or community schools, and also, very importantly, risk prevention research and mental health promotion research. And we, in partnership with roughly 60 educators, mostly building leaders, district central office leaders, school board leaders, delineated a suggested set of specific tasks that characterize an effective planning process, evaluation process, understanding the data and action planning process, implementation process, and finally beginning anew. We very much honor that the principal is the captain of the ship, and that he or she can't do everything at once, that we have to strategically decide what makes the most sense to focus on. And that's, I think, going back a couple of steps, the potential power and importance of school climate process measures, so that we're recording what did we decide to focus on and why. As many people know, Howard Edelman and Linda Taylor have a wonderful center at UCLA that's focused on promoting mental health in schools. Howard and Linda have a complementary model. Howard and Linda are members, actually, of the National School Climate Council, and their work has importantly colored and shaped all of our definitions and the school climate standards that I'll be talking about a little bit later. And finally, Jane Quinn and other people from the community schools movement have guides. This is one which are
Okay, I think at this point we're ready to talk a little bit about participants' thoughts on these type of school climate improvement processes, either PBIS or other approaches to school climate reform. We're going to pop up a survey for you to start responding to that. And while we do that, Jonathan, I think you'll note there's a few comments in the parking lot related to what you were just speaking about, maybe some opinions that run counter to what you were saying. So I would love for you to take a look at those and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and I'm just scrolling through these questions, and I can see that some people differ with some of what I was saying about PBIS. It was interesting. I know that as I mentioned that PBIS is really evolving. When I first did this kind of comparative analysis about a year and a half ago, I actually presented this at a small NEA meeting in Washington, and George Sagai, who was one of the co-founders of PBIS, was there, and I said to George beforehand I wanted him to really be ruthlessly honest about the ways in which he agreed and or disagreed with what I was saying. George was the first person to stand up and agreed at the time with that analysis. Now, I know that since that time, over the last, 14 or 15 months, PBIS has certainly been evolving, and I know that from colleagues in the state of Minnesota, we've had a lot of overlapping conversations, and a number of people have said to me exactly what this person, Cassandra Johnson, said in this notion that kind of PBIS is helpfully thought of as a piece of a comprehensive school climate reform model, and that understanding makes a lot of sense to me. I think that sometimes, particularly with students who are having real difficulty with behavior, having a top-down model, in my mind, is appropriate. And certainly one set of skills, one set of programmatic efforts that are in fact terribly helpful for us to be aware of and to sometime use. I'm not sure how what I'm going to say next fits with people's experience in the field across the country, but I know that in my travels, many principals have said to me that it was incredibly helpful to first introduce PBIS, that really having PBIS helped the school to, in a sense, calm down. But again and again, many of them reported that in some ways PBIS was simplistic and that it was so helpful to then think about school climate reform in the way that I'm describing. And they, like me, entry.
So without going too deeply into this, because I know we have some more content to cover and we have about a little less than 30 minutes left, I want to let you get into the next section and talk to us more about the next steps. And so as school leaders and policymakers, what should those folks be doing to take this information from school climate surveys and measures and do something actionable with that?
Okay. For school leaders, I think that thinking about what are your strategic goals, or as Joanne Freiberg talked about in that slide many slides ago, kind of under the line, kind of how can you develop goals that support proactive thinking, whether it's about individual student development and or systemically thinking about what can you and we do to create a safer, more engaging, supportive, healthy school climate. That's, to me, profound. The whole question about how do we engage students is a challenging one, and parents as well. And I'm appreciative that it's easy to say some of these things and much harder to do them in real life, which is actually one of the reasons why when I work with a district or with a state, or our center works with a district or a state, we're always invested in being learners from the people that we're working with, because there aren't simple cookie cutter strategies to do all of this. I'm very supportive of school leaders thinking about how can they use this data as a flashlight rather than a hammer, even though I'm painfully aware that particularly building and district and state leaders often experience the federal government as using data more as a hammer. I think I'm also very in favor of schools thinking about creating PLCs, or again, in Tony Brike's language, network improvement communities, where we're transparently sharing what our strategic goals are, sharing understandings about what kind of interventions, instructional, relational, and or school-wide improvement efforts are being used to try to move the needle, and then some kind of metrics, however simple that is. I think there's potentially tremendous power in our learning and working with colleagues, and we're doing that more and more at the district level and the state level, and we're actually in the process of creating a new web-based resource called the School Climate Resource Center, which is going to have a whole free Connect section really designed to support classroom leaders, and in some ways even more building leaders and district leaders learning from each other. And if any of you would like information about that, please do send me an email or give me a call. There's very interesting and somewhat dramatic growing interest in school climate policy guidelines. I think, kind of hearkening back to the beginning of this presentation, part of that is that the 49 bully prevention state laws, as terrible as many of them are, terrible in the sense that two-thirds of these relatively new laws only mandate two things: identify the bully and punish the bully. We know punishment doesn't work. But the effect of these laws, helpful or unhelpful, thoughtful or not, is that superintendents now feel in danger of being sued if they don't have, quote unquote, effective bully prevention efforts. And I get a call between once every couple of weeks and once every month from a superintendent somewhere in America who's scared because they know that state ed is saying you have to have a comprehensive, effective bully prevention effort, but they say to me again and again, I don't know what that means. No one is articulating what that means. And as many of you may know, certainly all of the short-term bully prevention efforts that we're utilizing of 8 sessions in a health class or a short-term curriculum show virtually no results at all. And even many of the more comprehensive programs that have some research base very often have little impact or marginal impact. That isn't necessarily because these are bad programs, but I think a lot of those programs are introduced in a total top-down way. Central office says we're going to have the ABC bully prevention program, and people have the experience of, once again, something's being pushed down their throat, and people have the predictable response to that. They want to throw up. They don't feel that they've been consulted. They've, in the language of restorative practices, they feel something is being done to them rather than with them. So the whole issue of implementation and the whole emergence of implementation science is, to me, extraordinarily important and extraordinarily exciting. There are more and more districts and states that are considering and or have started to adopt school climate policy guidelines. Many of these states and districts have actually used the National School Climate Council standards, which are 5 standards with 16 linked indicators and 36 sub-indicators that are, again, organized around the 3 essential questions that I articulated earlier. I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read this, but you can find these standards on our website, schoolclimate.org, and they, in a very detailed way, support a series of steps to support the principal setting in motion conversations about what kind of school do we want our school to be, typically using school climate surveys, what are our strengths and needs, and then conducting a gap analysis, thinking about what kind of goals make the most sense for us to work on. Some districts are creating comprehensive school climate policies. There's a little district outside of New Haven called the Westbrook School District in Connecticut, which I believe is the first district in the country to have adopted school climate standards, or excuse me, school climate policy. But there are other districts from Chicago to many others across the country that are right now thinking about comprehensive school climate policies and or standards for their district. And in a number of states, we're in the process of bringing together district leaders, both from central office and from school boards, to consider what are their existing policies related to bully prevention and or discipline and or curriculum and assessment, and to look at current school climate research and to support their considering how they may want to revise current policies and or adopt or adapt the school climate standards. And some are working in this comprehensive way. There are others who are focused on targeted policy reform. In other words, they're only looking at current discipline policy or codes of conduct or their school improvement policy and thinking about how can they make them more school climate friendly. Policy development is typically a top-down process, and I think it probably always needs to be to a great extent. As I've said in different ways before, one of the potential powers of school climate reform is this is a process of really mobilizing as many people in the whole school community as possible. And our recommendation, and there's a woman named Jessica Savage on our team, an attorney who's heading our policy and civil rights efforts and working very closely with a woman named Randy Ross in their work with districts across the country. There's lots of different ways of doing this, and we have a lot of experience based on our work in Westbrook, Connecticut, and consulting in Chicago and elsewhere about the range of ways that superintendents and other district and school board leaders can revise policy. There also were certainly challenges, as is always the case, competing priorities, a lack of time, but this is very doable and growing in very exciting ways. And if people would like to later learn about our work in Minnesota and nationally, please let me know, and I'll help to get you in touch with Jessica Savage, who heads up these efforts for us. There's a paradox. There certainly is growing appreciation of pro-social education, particularly social emotional learning. There is growing appreciation that bully prevention is essential. There is growing appreciation that discipline can and needs to be based on learning rather than punishment, and that it's truly shameful that we have the number of kids going from high school to prison that we do. But the paradox, the challenge, is American accountability systems and policies are still only focused on student cognitive learning. We still tend to operate in a very top-down manner without recognizing local voice in general and, importantly, student voice in particular. And our current accountability systems, as I've said a couple of times, discourage school leaders from embracing a continuous model of learning and development. These are, in my mind, big problems, big challenges. I would suggest that policy leaders need to consider how they want to define school climate. My bias, as I've articulated already, is that the National School Climate Council's definition of school climate, a positive school climate, and an effective school climate improvement process are the most research-based and the most comprehensive in ways that have the potential to support positive school improvement. I think that policy leaders need to recommend that schools routinely and comprehensively evaluate school climate. There's a debate going on about the pros and cons of measuring school climate annually versus every 2 or 3 years. Certainly the superintendents that I talk to across America have underscored to me the value of annual assessment, and I think I appreciate that. In fact, some of them have said this is simply essential, that people in the community need this. Another truth, though, is that the school climate improvement process takes longer than a year, so that the extent to which we're using school climate measurement to evaluate, for example, over a 3-year period, have our bully prevention, have our pro-social improvement goals made a difference, a 3-year time frame is one that makes more sense to me. And as I've said in a variety of ways, I think it behooves local and state and federal policymakers and shapers to really move policy and accountability systems to a place that supports a more continuous model of learning and development. I believe that's an essential goal. I think policymakers and leaders also need to think about credentials. In fact, Minnesota and several other states have come to us because several years in partnership with people from the Harvard School of Education, the Character Education Partnership, and the National Dropout Prevention, and the University of Missouri's Center for Citizenship and Character, we've created a school climate leadership certificate program, and Minnesota is working with us to certify a group of state leaders and regional leaders, and the hope is that this will eventually move down to district leadership and building leadership And there are several other states that we're in conversation with about doing the same thing. That's an important goal. We also certainly need to encourage teacher preparation programs to focus on understanding school climate and what are our current research-based guidelines and tools that support this process. And certainly we need more research. Most of the school climate research today is correlational. It is true that there's a small and significant growing number of school climate experimental studies, randomized control studies, and I think very interestingly and importantly, as Tony Breik has been a leader in, combining experimental study with ethnographic study. I think all researchers know that each research methodology has strengths and limitations. And I think that it's incredibly important for us to use multiple methods of research.
Jonathan, that's a great segue to one of the questions that just came in the parking lot. Stanley's asking about some recommendations for valid and reliable measures that you might recommend. And I don't know if you want to,
well,
I know you're talking about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm biased because I'm at the National School Climate Center, and I think that our comprehensive school climate inventory is the best. The fact that, as I mentioned before, the 3 existing independent evaluations of school climate evaluation all agree with me, so I feel a little bit more comfortable saying that. I generally feel disinclined to push any one product that our center has. I don't want this to become an info commercial, but that certainly is one terrific measure which is aligned with everything that I said, that it's reliable, it's valid, it's 15 to 20 minutes, and very importantly, and this is growing, the report is linked to an extraordinary body of resources about what are concrete next steps that school leaders can take. But the other important truth that I want to underscore is that the Safe and Supportive Schools TA Center has a list of lots of different school climate measures. I don't exactly understand what criteria, if any, they have about what measures are listed or not listed, but I do know that that list importantly includes reliable and valid tools which are available for free. My understanding is that virtually all of those surveys that are free, either the school has to score it and or it doesn't generate a report and or it isn't linked to concrete possible next steps, but I am appreciative that some schools have no money or less rather than more money, and to understand kind of where can we go to learn about the array of comprehensive school climate measures that recognize student, parent, and school personnel voice is an important resource.
This is opening up a couple related questions, so I do want to continue along this stream so that we can make sure we respond to folks. One is, and this came in also in the registration questions, are the measures that you've been discussing for the most part, or do you know of anyone that's specifically geared towards early childhood?
I'm not aware of school climate measures that are kindergarten or pre-K. And in fact, my understanding is that although there are some school climate measures that start in kindergarten or first grade, it's so problematic to administer them because the teacher has to read the questions aloud to the students, and there's naturally going to be tremendous variation in terms of kind of kids' language abilities, simply kind of receptive language abilities, and their capacity to understand those questions, that it takes a long time, so that more often than not, school climate surveys start being administered in second or third grade.
But in those settings, it would be useful to use other measures, correct? You know, not just
yes,
surveys.
yeah.
You could still gather information from your other
That's right. That's right. And I think that I mean the other very important truth, and this happens in lots of schools already, is that teachers can and I think should consider setting in motion conversations with kindergarten kids and even pre-kindergarten kids about how safe are they feeling and what helps them to feel safe, what by mistake gets in the way of their feeling safe, what kind of experiences helps them to feel supported and caring about school, and the flip side of that, because that's data, which is very meaningful data. And as we all know, many pre-K teachers and kindergarten, first grade teachers are exquisitely attuned to these fundamentally important social and emotional and civic and ethical dimensions of both student learning and classroom life.
Right, and of course, an acknowledgement of that will help down the line as students are asked in later grades to articulate that. So
That's right.
I think
That's right.
The other question that came in, and this is somewhat loaded regarding the policy and the financial support, is really how do we ensure that the right people understand this issue and put the dollars toward these efforts, and understanding that this is, yes, there are free measures, there are free surveys that are available out there, but like you alluded to, that really isn't the whole package, that there's much more needed to both.
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, I'm certainly in favor of the federal government, of state DOEs allocating more money to effective school climate improvement. But the other truth is there's a tremendous amount that building leaders and district leaders can do for no money at all. If you think about Joanne Freiberg's slide, where she talked about how the two top boxes on the top are about reacting to student problems and or reacting to school-wide issues versus working under the box. If we as a building leader support all of our colleagues thinking very concretely about what are the range of ways where we're all understandably pulled into reacting and putting out fires, a common, terrible, real phenomena, but then also support colleagues thinking about what are the range of ways, little or big, that we can also be thinking proactively. We can be using ourselves as a teacher and or a member of a team to intentionally support kids' social and emotional and ethical development, that we can intentionally create an even safer, more supportive, engaging school. There's in fact a tremendous amount that we can do that costs nothing at all.
We're rounding up on our hour, and I want to make sure that we get to one of our last questions for folks. I'm going to actually skip over this one that's on the slide now, because we've had a lot of talk about that. And Jonathan, if you could just do a quick summary, and then we're going to ask folks what their takeaways are and do some wrap up for today.
Okay. So, I mean, in essence, what I'm saying echoes what our center just recently learned from these almost 700 building and district leaders. School climate matters. How we feel in school, how we're learning and working together is profoundly important. It really creates the foundation for healthy development and student learning and effective teamwork. It's also important to know that there are tools out there, many of them reliable and valid, some not yet reliable and valid, which have the potential to shed light on what are our strengths and needs, as well as to powerfully support planning and to support school community partnership processes. Again, something that we all know that matters but too often don't do. And that school climate improvement, it's a process of setting goals, a process of engaging as many people in the community as possible, and it's something that's very importantly aligned with and supports implementation science. Again, in ways that I've touched on but haven't talked about in too much detail, there's a growing body of work from people like Dean Fixon and Michael Fullen and Tony Bright and many others who are importantly studying what actually supports effective school improvement efforts. And That's important. And all of school climate improvement, all of the different dimensions that I've been describing are aligned with and support implementation science. And that finally, policy and practice needs to converge on these common goals of understanding and supporting kids and parents and guardians, school personnel, and community members and leaders learning and working together in ways that can be literally transformational.
What a nice, succinct summary. Thank you, Jonathan. Before we let everyone go for the day, we want to open up one last poll. We're interested in hearing from you all. What are your key takeaways from today's presentation? And as a result of today's webinar and the information you've learned, what action steps do you plan to take? As we said from the beginning, we really want this to be useful to you. We want to promote change in the places where you work. So we're hoping that you have some concrete ideas about what you plan to do with this information. And while we're doing that, if you have any lingering questions, please post them in the parking lot. I think we've addressed just about everything that's come in throughout the webinar, but we will be happy to respond to those after the hour is finished if needed.
That's true. And also, if people later in the day, literally or figuratively, have other questions, please do feel free to email me or to call me. I'd be more than happy to be responsive and helpful in any and all ways that I can.
And in just a moment, we'll put up that slide with Jonathan's information. And just as a reminder, folks can download today's presentation down in the resources to download box. It has all of the slides there. You will also receive an email in the next day or so with the archive of today's event, so you can share it with colleagues or listen to segments again if you were not able to attend the full event. And again, there's a lot of web links there that Jonathan mentioned during today's presentation, so if you find those useful, you can click on those and it should take you right to the website. So it looks like today's presentation affirmed for some what's happening in their schools or districts. Some folks have learned something new to apply. I think Stephen's comment, the complexity of the issue, that's true. Even for me, learning about this and working with you, Jonathan, and I'm realizing just how complex it is and why it's so critical that we pay attention to it, both as educators and consumers of education as parents, students. And it's wonderful to see some really good action steps and folks wanting to share this information and go back and take it to your districts and think about how you can make small changes and use some of the strategies and ideas that you had learned in today's webinar. So since we're rounding up on our time together, I'd like to give a big virtual round of applause to Jonathan Cohen for the wealth of information he shared with us today. I'm very appreciative, and I hope you all are too. And I'm just going to quickly go through the slides here so you can see the contact information. You'll see some resources that are available. You'll see our contact information. And then you'll see our upcoming webinar in the month of June is on the topic of culturally responsive classrooms. I think it's a nice follow-up to this conversation about school climate. We'll be working with Dr. Tomlinson Clark and Dr. Latimer from Rutgers on that topic. So please do register and plan to join us for that event. And finally, we do really value your input, and we want to make sure that this is a series that serves your needs. So we'll have you complete this survey. It should take just a few moments, and we do use that information to improve our series. At this time, we are going to finish for today. There's some questions about the transcript for the parking lot and the different questions. Those should be available in the archive. So you can feel free to download that archive, save it, and you should have all the information that came through in today's webinar. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye for now.